Hello and welcome to Chapter 2. This week we're going to be taking a look at systems of privilege and inequality, examining the differences among women and the multifaceted identities in women's lives. So what I'd like to do is explain some of the larger theoretical concepts framing the chapter. There isn't a whole lot of new vocabulary this week. It's mostly breaking down larger frameworks. Okay, so let's get started. I put together a condensed version of the slideshow, of the PowerPoint slides. Okay, so let's take a look here. So you've heard me discuss in the previous weeks in our course, weeks 1, 2, and 3, about the idea of social constructions, forming our understanding of who we are as individuals. Okay, so this is not a new idea to you, right? Social constructions are embedded into our everyday life. But what we want to do this week is think about how societies overall come to understand some very basic fundamental ideals and concepts. So if you've taken anthropology, particularly social, cultural anthropology, the issues that and concepts I'm going to spend the next few minutes reviewing will sound familiar to you. So the concept of normality within a society, these concepts help to create the idea, for example, that there is one way that a family should be. The concept of a nuclear family, okay? That a family should consist of a male head of the family, female head of the family. And in the 20th century, we saw the concept that there would be, two children, maybe 4 children. That is a very modern concept of the family. Okay. When we think about what is considered normal, and yes, normal is in quotes, so I'm going to use the air quotes here, what is considered normal within a specific society, those concepts often reflect, okay, the identities of who has power in that society. And here in the United States, that is not different in any way, shape, or form. Okay? So as the slide says, and I've taken this specifically out of the textbook, right? What is considered normal in a society is often reflected by those whose identities hold power in American society. How we define normal, right, is going to look exactly like those people who have the most power in society. And this is true everywhere because societies operate by sets of rules. Sometimes they are written down, they are codified, they are put into law. Okay, and if they are not actually codified in written law, then it's passed on through other forms of community understanding and engagement. Okay, so I asked students to spend a little time thinking about how we as a society define and conceptualize normality. And you can think about this for a few minutes on your own. Obviously, if we had been in a classroom together, I would put you in a small group for, 10 minutes, do a few exercises thinking about, as you were growing up, what messages did you receive through education, through television, mass media, your parents, okay, in terms of what it meant to be, again, in quotes, excuse me, normal in contemporary American society. So let's take a look at some of the new vocabulary in this chapter. And this vocabulary we see our editors use throughout the textbook. Okay. You have probably already seen them talk about discourse and regimes of truth. But what is really meant by these terms? Discourse in general means usually the way something is spoken, how it is talked about, okay, how we come to understand it. So the literal definition, which I have here in the PowerPoint, let's take a look at that. Discourse is the process of creating knowledge, or a culturally constructed representation of reality. It involves language and other categories of meaning that work with social. It could be material practices to produce a, again in quotes, regime of truth. So this is a term when philosophers, critical theorists use the term discourse. They are using this specific term to evoke a way of thinking critically about how a society, a culture, comes to understand the larger meaning of something. And usually, the larger meanings are being sent to that society, right, through some kind of authoritative power, hence the regimes of truth. So the regimes of truth tell us, right, what are appropriate in any given context. They are societal rules which can be, quote, taken for granted regarding what people can say, who it is possible to be, and what it is possible to do. Regimes of truth are shaped by general rules. And then there are a couple of examples that I pulled from our chapter. Our chapter uses those examples, and I'll explain and tease out those examples in just a minute. So this sounds very intense, right? Oh my gosh, Professor, you're going on and on about discourse and regimes of truth, and that's so abstract. So let me break it down so it doesn't feel so abstract out there. When we grow up and we go to elementary school and we go to junior high and we go to high school, we are learning, we are taking in so much information. It's coming from everywhere. It's coming from the books we read, what the teachers are telling us. It's coming from our parents. It's coming from our friends on the playground. It's coming from our brothers, our sisters. It's coming from the television. It's coming from the radio. It's coming from the newspapers, right? Everywhere. We're taking in information. Okay. And we're also maturing on our own. We have our own maturation processes. Now, the real challenge, okay, is how do we as individuals interpret all of that information? Because that information is not always in and of itself bias free. within every culture and every society, there are larger goals and objectives. And that's what we are asking you to think critically about in this chapter. So much of what we think we just take for granted, okay, we've never looked at critically. But we're asking you to do that in this chapter, okay? Have you ever thought, for example, okay, I'm going to come in here now and we're going to take a look at the bottom example here, patriotism. Patriotism. Okay? Why do you, when you are in elementary school, every day say the Pledge of Allegiance? You ever thought about that? You probably didn't. But somewhere along the line, right, somebody decided that American children needed to, every day at school, get up and say the Pledge of Allegiance. Well, the truth is, historically, children in the United States did not always do that. Did you know that? And don't worry if you didn't know that. I would not blame you. I'm a historian, right? No, we did not always do that. One nation under God, indivisible. Well, we had a civil war, didn't we? You bet we did. So they were not saying that. Not until well into the 20th century, decades after the Civil War. Okay? So this was done, right, for very specific reasons to inculcate into you, right, a sense of patriotism. Okay? Okay, well, that's not necessarily bad. Okay? However, we will all have our own individual understandings of what it means to be patriotic. Okay? But a larger power, regimes of truth, okay, can call into question, are you patriotic enough? Have you done your patriotic values? Okay? And right now, in a very divided country, there are real questions about what it means to be an American. Okay? And that should never be questioned, right? If you were born here in the United States, as long as you are paying your taxes and abiding by the law, you're an American. Okay? But this can become a very hot topic. Okay? And people, right, feel that they have the right to question other people. These other two examples, for example, that was kind of a silly sentence. Other two examples, for example. Strike, take that back. So, science. Okay? Science is an authoritative, okay, discipline. Most Americans believe in science. Okay? If I pick up this pen, what will happen? If you were live, you would say, Professor, that pen's going to drop. And why is that pen going to drop? Right? Because of the law of gravity. You know that, and I know that. The law of gravity. It is science. Cannot be disputed. Science. We don't question science. It is an authoritative regime of truth. Okay? And for many people, religion is also falls into that category for themselves. Okay? And so people in general, right, when it comes to these regimes of truth, they say, well, we'll just take it for granted, and we'll follow all of these. But as I first mentioned earlier, okay, as you are growing up, you become an adult. You are now, right? You're 17, you're 18, you're 20, you're 22, you're 24, you're 25. Some of you could be 30. You could be well past that, right? You're returning to college. And we all possess agency. Agency, one of the most critical concepts, right? Humans have active free will, and humans can, if desired, use their free will to negotiate ideologies, right? Ideologies, the larger value system that is being imposed upon them. They can negotiate with ideologies. They can accept them. They can resist them, right? And or modify them. Oh, okay. This part of my religion I agree with. The other part I'm not so sure, but I'm still gonna practice my faith. Okay, right? You have human agency. You can do that. So why do we look at all of this, right, in chapter 2? We start to look at this because we need to really break down how systems of privilege and inequality work in our society, and how many times, okay, societies uh, function and societies recognize that there are differences amongst people. I have brown hair. Some people have blonde hair, right? Some people are tall, some people are short. Okay. Some people have lighter skin, some people have darker skin, some people have blue eyes, some people have brown eyes. And societies recognize these differences and they assign group membership based on those differences, whatever those perceived differences are. And many times, the vast majority of times, right, there will be ranking that occurs, right, through differences and institutionalization. Oh, my society, okay, I want to create the perfect society. And in my society, I want only brown-haired people and brown-eyed people because I'm in charge. And in my society, you're only going to speak my language and you're only going to worship my God. Well, that should sound very familiar to you, right? Because if it doesn't, then you've never studied history. Okay? You can go take a look at Nazi Germany, and you can take a look at the antebellum South, which imposed an entire racialized society based on the oppression of enslaved Africans and African Americans. So, excuse me, institutionalization, right, is something that is embedded in a larger fabric, right, of American society. And this happens not only in terms of race, it happens in terms of gender, right? And any way that peoples can distinguish one another. Judith Lorber's essay, which was assigned last week, right, did a very good job of looking at how societies rank people. So let's take a look at some very good examples that you will probably be a little more familiar with in terms of the systemic ways of institutionalized inequities. A very good example our textbook gives of systems of privilege are standardized tests like the SATs, right? And if you finish college and you want to go to graduate school, then you'll take the GREs, the graduate record exams. Mm-hmm. And these exams are incredibly biased, right? They contain gendered language that is more familiar to boys rather than girls, and they are inherently class biased, right? Using language, right, that unless you had access to a great tutor, right, and a vocabulary, you're not going to score well on those exams at all. Right? So I want to spend just a few moments talking about the concept embedded in the middle of chapter 2, because there are lots of references to the concept of white privilege. So our editors give an appropriate editorial nod and citation to a very famous essay and theory that was um, written about way back in 1979, and that was by a very famous feminist scholar, Peggy McIntosh. And she wrote her essay called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, which discusses um, the multiple dimensions of privilege through race, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality. Now, what I usually have students do, again, if we're in the classroom, I would have you do a little bit of work with McIntosh's essay, because she went home one day. She was working in women's studies, and she had been writing about male privilege and the fact that many of her colleagues, men most of the time, did not recognize many of the natural advantages they had living in a patriarchal society. And many of the times when she asked them about that, they were oblivious to it and denied it. And so as she started thinking more and more about that, she realized that, well, maybe she as a white woman probably had a lot of unearned advantages as well. So that's what prompted her essay, right? Unpacking her knapsack of white privilege. And she put together a brilliant argument, actually, and then a whole list of advantages. And she asked ultimately that everyone who read her article think about their status in society. She didn't have any answers on necessarily on what would be the best way to move forward. Again, she wrote this decades ago, but she was hoping to prompt a good conversation. Well, her work, was groundbreaking at the time, and many scholars have followed up on her work since then. One thing that I did make sure to carry over for this week that you can do, and I have embedded it in the original PowerPoint slide, is watch this 13-minute clip from Jane Elliott's The Angry Eye. And Jane Elliott did pioneering work looking at race relations, and she is indeed looking at white privilege. So I encourage students to watch this experiment that she's doing with college students. Again, she's separating brown eyes from blue-eyed students and doing a power experiment with them. And it's an intense 13-minute, 39-second video, but it's quite good, very powerful. So one of the last things I want us to take a look at today, very briefly, two of the supplemental essays this week is take a look at what Audre Lorde wrote in the short excerpt you have. There is no hierarchy of oppression, and then Gina Crossley Corcoran's piece explaining white privilege to a broke white person. So Audre Lorde was a phenomenal woman, brilliant writer, poet, civil rights activist. And you see in the excerpt that you have, starting on page 75, right? There is no hierarchy of oppression. She says, right? As a Black lesbian feminist, socialist, poet, mother of two, including one boy, and a member of an interracial couple, I usually find myself part of some group in which the majority defines me as deviant, difficult, inferior, or just plain wrong. From my membership in all of these groups, I have learned that oppression and the intolerance of difference come in all shapes and sizes and colors and sexualities, and that among those of us who share the goals of liberation and a workable future for our children, there can be no hierarchy of oppression. Now, Lord wrote this in 1983, and this was at a time when feminists, and particularly feminists of color, were working incredibly hard to articulate a vision of what we now call uh, intersectionality, right? Finding a way that a way to articulate the nuances in which people, all of us, many of us, have multiple identities, right? We can be, as Lord is, right? She's lesbian, right? She's Black, okay? She's a poet. She's in an interracial relationship. And it's too much to say, oh, Audra, did you wake up today and which one of these identities did you feel most oppressed by? And she could not say, oh, well, gosh, today I'm going to just put on my hat solely as a Black woman. And I'm only going to fight the challenges today just as a Black woman. Because you can't do that, right? Because she's also a lesbian. And she's also a member of an interracial couple. And she's also a member of a mom. Well, she's also a mom. Okay? We can't separate out all of these different identities. Okay? And we can't say, oh, who's got, the most oppressive issue. Okay? There's no hierarchy here. Right? We have to fight on all fronts and recognize, right, the interconnectedness of all of these issues. Now, in a very interesting essay written, right? Let's see, if Lord was 83, let's say 93, 03, 30 years later, okay, Gina Crossley Corcoran, right, wrote a short piece, right, in direct response to Peggy McIntosh, right, explaining white privilege to a broke white person. And I really appreciate this piece, right? Because what she wants to add into the arguments is the issue of class. So on page 77, she says, the concept of intersectionality recognizes that people can be privileged in some ways and definitely not privileged in others. And it adds, again, some nuance to understanding. And I really like this part on the right-hand column where she says, and listen, recognizing privilege doesn't mean suffering guilt or shame for your lot in life. Nobody's saying that straight, white, middle class, able-bodied males are all a bunch of assholes who don't work hard for what they have. Recognizing privilege simply means being aware that some people have to work much harder just to experience the things you take for granted, if they ever can experience them at all. And this brings me to the YouTube clip that I put on our lesson folder, that little 4-minute clip uh, where people are going to run that race to catch that $100 bill. Right? I love how that visual really illustrates, right, that the idea that we live in a meritocracy, right, that there's actually a level playing field that we all start out on, that's a big myth. Right? We do not live in this meritocracy, that we're all going to advance equally and we all start out on an equal field. We don't. It's a great myth, but it's not true. Okay? There are many structural barriers and inequities built into our systems that we aren't aware of. That's what our chapter is having us look at and break down. So again, I'm just going to close out here with a little visual on intersectionality, right? Looking at the numerous ways, okay, that systems of inequality reinforce inequality and privilege, particularly when they interconnect, right? It could be ageism and racism, or classism, or sexism. Okay. Okay. Have a good week. Until next week and chapter 4.